Welcome to another episode of the SNA Speakeasy. Today is our first one where we're going to look a little bit at the country of Indonesia. And we have a fellow journalist who is our guest today. His name is Nithin Coca. And beyond that, let me ask him. So, who are you and what kind of work have you been doing in recent years?
Great. Well, happy to be here. So yeah, I'm a freelance journalist. I've been covering kind of Asia broadly, but I think specifically Indonesia for about 5 years. I was previously based in Indonesia for about 2 years total. Initially started working as a journalist covering the 2014 presidential elections there. And since then, I've been kind of expanded to cover, human rights issues, environmental issues, development, politics, looking for interesting interconnections between particular sectors. Because I think to understand a country as complex as Indonesia, you have to look outside of different silos. And very interested also in kind of the connections, interconnection, supply chains between Indonesia and East Asia, including Japan and China.
Yes, that's obviously there are many. In my own reading on Indonesia isn't that deep, but when I was doing it 20 or 30 years ago, it was mostly about the Sukarno era. So
Mm.
many of the more recent episodes I'm not quite as familiar with. So that's one of the reasons we're doing this to help bring us up to speed. Um, the one thing that we've been seeing in newspapers recently here in Japan is regarding high-speed railway projects.
Mhm.
This is kind of our focus, I think, here today. So first of all, just kind of give us an overview. What are these projects? Who created them? And why are they important for the country?
Yeah, so I think to understand what's going on, kind of connects to the 2014 elections. President Joko Widodo, Jokowi, as he's popularly known, he was elected on this very kind of developmentalist platform. He saw Indonesia, I think, for decades as underinvested in infrastructure, and he saw like there's a real need for the country to massively upgrade all types of infrastructure, including railways. I think until recently, most of the railway in Indonesia was still the Dutch colonial era system. It had not been really upgraded in decades, and there was just a lot of lack of. I think the World Bank had placed it as one of the, I think, number 121, I believe, for infrastructure costs, logistical costs,
So hold on
the
a
cost of
second.
doing business.
Just for those of who may not know the country quite well. Now, if my memory serves, the Dutch colonial period ended in 1949. Is that correct?
Yeah, so yeah, 1949. So
So that means that
you can
all of the
imagine it's
railways that they were using, even into the 21st century, were built in the 1940s and 30s.
even before that. So it's a very legacy system.
I'd say
Um,
so.
when I went, when I first went to Indonesia in 2010, people were still riding on top of train cars, and they were using, I think, a third generation pass-me-down railways from Japan and Europe. It was a very, very outdated and kind of useless, not very useful infrastructure for the country. So Jacoby, he his big plan was like he's going to be the infrastructure president. He's going to bring a lot of foreign investment into the country. He's going to upgrade the rail system, the ports, the airports, everything to make Indonesia like a business-friendly country. And a big part of that was rail. So I think there's several projects that have been very high profile in the country. The most high profile one, I think, is the Jakarta Bandung, high profile and controversial, is the Jakarta Bandung high speed rail connecting Indonesia's capital and its third largest city. It's only 150 kilometers, so it's not a very long train line. But it was one that, in the very early year, very beginning of his presidency, was a flashpoint. Like China and Japan were both fighting to win this contract, and it was very controversially given to China. Japan has also since then, has built the Jakarta Mass Rapid Transit, like the urban metro rail system, which opened last year, and is currently building the Jakarta Surabaya medium speed rail line, which may be integrated with the high speed rail. We're kind of uncertain about that right now.
Okay, well, let's take these strands somewhat separately. Um, so the high speed rail you say is between Jakarta, the capital city, or I guess for now the capital city. I've heard rumors that he may want to move it, but from Jakarta to Bandung,
Mhm.
and so when you say high speed rail, I believe you have a lot of experience in Japan. How would it compare with the Shinkansen? I mean, is this a very similar kind of system to that, or is it kind of a chopped down version of the Shinkansen?
I'm unsure the top speed, but I know when Japan made their proposal or the for that project, it was going to be a Shinkansen line. So it was going to be the same technology as you would see in Japan. I think the Chinese technology is quite similar. They're not identical. So it would be a kind of a very modern high-speed rail line, was the plan.
Okay. And what is the status of that project at this moment, as far as we know?
Yeah, so it hasn't gone as well as planned. I think the president Jacoby he was up for re-election last year, and I think in his ideal world, the high-speed rail plan and the Jakarta Mass Rapid Transit would have both opened prior to his election campaign and been kind of the focal points. The MRT did open, and he rode it like 2 or 3 weeks before the election, and it was, I think, a big part of his re-election. The high-speed rail was a big liability. It's been beset by all types of delays. Land acquisition has been a problem. Drainage issues have been a problem. I don't think the Chinese contractors and kind of the plan kind of took into consideration Indonesia's very challenging topography and geography as a very mountainous, volcanic country with a very quite similar to Japan in a lot of ways. So would have made a lot of sense. I think Japan had a better technical expertise for Indonesia. And it was supposed to open in 2019. It's now been delayed to 2021. The last I heard, it's very likely it's not going to open until 2022. So it's several years behind schedule and well over budget. I believe just this week they kind of announced like they're halfway done. But and then the most recent thing that has happened last month. The project was kind of halted due to flooding in January, and then the pandemic hit, so that also kind of halted construction of all types of projects. Now the government actually wants to integrate the Bandung Jakarta high-speed rail with the Jakarta Surabaya medium rail that Japan consortium is working on, which is very surprising because I don't think there's any instance in the world where Japan and China would be collaborating on an infrastructure project like this.
So yeah, I mean, it sounds like if Japan, you said, quite successfully put together the Jakarta MRT, but China is having quite a bit of trouble with its line to Bandung. It seems kind of something of an embarrassment to China, in sort of their competition with Japan. I mean, clearly, it seems like these two East Asian countries are the main competitors in these rail lines. I guess I should ask you that question. Was anybody else in the game, or was it always just China versus Japan in building these rail lines?
It really is just China and Japan. Like, there's not very many European companies bidding on projects in Southeast Asia. There's a small project. I think there's one light rail project being built by by the Korean government supported project. But otherwise, it's really, and I think you'll see it all across Southeast Asia. It's really just China and Japan are the two options, and the only two countries willing to kind of put in the money and kind of make the kind of agreements and investments that are necessary to kind of make these projects work in such a developing country environment. So I think Indonesia is trying to be very strategic. They want both Japan and China to invest because they realize one country is not going to be able to fulfill the infrastructure needs. So that's why I think they felt the need they had to give some projects to China and some projects to Japan and try to create some sort of balance, but also kind of a competition so that they can get the best deal and the
Hmm.
best kind of financing.
Sure, you don't want to depend on only one vendor, one bidder. That's a very weak position to be in. Um, okay, let's take a look a little bit more at the Jakarta MRT. What do we know about it? I mean, obviously, for a capital city to have a functioning and presumably very good MRT system is pretty crucial. What was the situation before this MRT opened? Was there any kind of subway or any sort of service within Jakarta? And I've heard Jakarta's famous for traffic jams. So how does this affect that situation?
Yeah, so you're right. Jakarta is very famous for traffic. It's a mega city of 20 to 25 million people with it had the same as I mentioned earlier, kind of the legacy Dutch kind of commuter rail system that didn't really work within the urban environment. It really connected the suburbs to the city. Um, so there's been several attempts over the last decades to build some sort of urban mass rail transit system in Jakarta. and they've all failed mostly due to Indonesian government mismanagement of just funds or corruption. So the fact that Jokowi came in as president and was able to kind of push the project forward, and the fact that when I was there reporting on this, like people were always praising like the Japanese companies, saying they're doing such a good job. They're doing like we could never have done this without Japan's help. It really was I heard a lot of just positive comments about how the project was being run. The praise was being given both to Jokowi for being the manager, the former Jakarta governor Ahok, and also the Japanese consortium, or the Japanese JICA and the people funding and building the project. So I think it's been a big success. It's only one line. One line doesn't make a big difference in a city of 25 million. So I don't think it's had a measurable impact on traffic, but I think it's had a measurable impact in terms of like national psyche and also just pride
Right.
to finally have a line and to kind of join the club is quite significant. And Japan has been awarded kind of doing the second phase of the MRT. So I think there's a potential for this to be an ongoing long-term kind of collaboration between the two countries.
And is it pretty much a state-of-the-art subway?
Yeah, I think it's comparable. Yeah, it's a state-of-the-art, very modern, I think fully automated system. Um, so it's quite a contrast from the crowded buses and people sitting on trains from just a decade ago. It's a very, very different. It was fascinating to be there when it opened and kind of it people were taking photos and treating it was like Disneyland. The way people were seeing it as a tourist attraction was, I think, yeah, just really nice to see and a very crowning achievement for Jokowi.
Okay, excellent. And you say that this one line is probably going to be supplemented in future years by additional lines. Do we have any idea about the schedule on that, or is it just not clear at this point?
The last I saw, I think towards the end of last year, they awarded this contracts for the second phase. I'm not sure. I don't believe they've started construction yet. Maybe pre-construction, but it looks like um, I believe it's going to be going forward. And I believe the timeline is to open the second line in the next 5 to 7 years.
Okay. And then the third of the railways that you mentioned earlier on was Jakarta to Surabaya. Explain what is the distance of Jakarta to Surabaya, and why is it medium speed? Why isn't it high speed?
Yeah, so Jakarta to Surabaya it's the two main cities on different ends of Java. So it's about I believe 450 to 500 kilometers. Um, it was awarded to Japan in 2019. It was kind of framed as like we're sorry we didn't give you the Bandung line, so here's a Surabaya line instead. Um, it seems like it was technical considerations, I think, that led them to choose a medium speed instead of a high speed. I think just dealing with the topography or geography of the region of that line area and kind of what could fit into the space that they had. I think it sounds like a medium line just made more sense than a high speed line. And I believe they've broken construction on that. It's compared to the Bandung high speed line. Apparently, it's going very well and things are on schedule. And it's under budget and probably will open. It looks like it's only been a few years, but it looks like it'll open on time. I believe it's 2023 is when that was scheduled to be opened.
Okay, so potentially just like a year or so after the Bandung line constructed by the Chinese.
Yeah, though now that they want them to combine it, I'm not sure like what that'll look like.
So how do
The
you?
timeline for that.
Well, first of all, what is a? I mean, I understand what a high speed railway is because I have the Shinkansen here in Japan, which I ride many times. But I'm not
Mhm.
exactly sure what medium speed railway means. So, do you have a sense of what a medium speed railway is like?
Yeah, I believe I think that it's just in terms of speed, I think it's between 100 and 150 kilometers per hour. So I guess faster than a conventional kind of urban line, but not as fast as a high speed line.
I would guess so. And how many stations does it have along the way? Is it quite frequent stations, or is it like kind of an express train that goes a long way without any stations?
I think they're planning quite a few stations. The first phase that's under construction now is going to Semarang, which is the capital of Central Java. So a city I think of about 1 to 2 million. And then the second phase would be Semarang to Surabaya, and I believe it makes I believe it would make many stops, as it's a very densely populated Java has more people than Honshu. It's the most populated island in the world. So there would be a definitely need for a lot of that for that corridor is one of the most densely populated regions in the world. So
Hmm. And what kind of city is Surabaya? What's its character compared to Jakarta?
Surabaya it's a distant, I guess a distant second. It's not a mega city like Jakarta. It's about 3 to 4 million people. It's a major port for a lot of kind of agricultural exports. It's a big processing center for kind of goods coming from eastern half of Indonesia. So it has I think, a very powerful, a very important logistical role in Indonesia. Um, and I think the rail line it would help to just, better connect the capital with Surabaya with Jakarta and with other cities on the north coast of Java. Um, and I think it would also, Indonesia is a very overly centralized country. So having good infrastructure in places like Surabaya helps kind of shift the burden away from Jakarta and helps other cities kind of also develop and grow prosperous. And I think you mentioned earlier kind of the new capital. I think that's Jokowi is also trying to, provide infrastructure and incentives to other regions of Indonesia. And I think building rail lines is a big key part of how you get other regions to also be able to develop economically.
Right. Okay, so you've mentioned already a couple of times, but I've been kind of holding you off because I wanted to ask it separately. So, what do we know about this proposal that somehow this line to Bandung being constructed by the Chinese and this medium speed railway to Surabaya being constructed by the Japanese are supposed to be connected or partner? I mean, it would seem to me that how would you? I mean, how does a high speed rail connect to a medium speed rail? I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Yeah, I think most of us are still wondering what it means because it came kind of out of nowhere. All of a sudden, the government saying like, actually, let's have Japan also be part of this project and let's combine it. Um, I saw an article in Japanese media saying that the Japanese government was surprised and didn't expect this at all, and they were not kind of notified before it was public. So
And how long ago was this that this news came out?
this is just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, so quite recently. Um, just so I have one theory. I have a couple of theories. I think one of it might be like this is just they're trying to find a way to cut down on costs. With the pandemic going on, Indonesia is facing probably huge government deficits this year. So maybe a way to kind of how do we reduce the infrastructure spending cost? It could be a way to put pressure on China. They have not done a good job so far. They've been over budget. They're not meeting timelines. So maybe it's an implicit threat. If you don't get your act together, we're going to give the project or force you to work with Japan. And I don't think China wants to do that. It could be a first step towards, actually giving the whole project to a Japanese consortium or bringing someone else on board. Um, so I think Indonesia is very good, I think, compared to a lot of countries in Southeast Asia and I think in South Asia, but at being very, very strategic about how they play off different countries and investors. So they want to get the best deal possible. They got a very good deal with the Jakarta Bandung rail, much, much better than what you see in Malaysia or Pakistan or other countries with Chinese investment because they've really played hardball and forced China to put a deal that was basically what would give Indonesia like control, put very little liability on the country. So I think this could be another way they're trying to ensure that they have the leverage to ensure to force China to fulfill its obligations, but also keep a way to maybe have a second, if it doesn't work out, have a backup plan.
Mm. Um, I presume that this project, from the China's point of view, is part of their famous Belton Road initiative or something like this.
Mhm.
And then Japan doesn't have a fancy name for it, but they do seem to be wanting to compete with China in many markets. But this seems to be one of the main sort of cockpits or venues for them to actually be directly competing on infrastructure. Um, to what extent do you feel that they've been successful? It sounds like in this particular case, Japan's got the upper hand because they're managing it better. But what are the kind of perceptions that you understand to be from the Indonesian side?
Yeah, I think I I think for Indonesia, like I think that's how I see it from both sides. Indonesia is the biggest country in Southeast Asia. It has a huge amount of infrastructure need. For companies in Japan and Korea who want to export technology, this is like where to do it. This is the biggest market they're going to have access to, and the biggest market that's under competition. So I think from that perspective, they see Indonesia is really critical to kind of the economies of both Japan and Korea, and to a lot of companies, especially rail, but also coal technology and other types of transportation infrastructure. And I think from Indonesia's perspective, um, like they have just so much need for so much infrastructure. There's so many potential projects. These three rail lines we mentioned are just the first three. There's plans to build rail lines on Sumatra, which is the island to the west of Indonesia. They want to build rail lines in Borneo. They want to improve infrastructure on all these other islands. So doing it well in Java is opens the door to projects all across the country. So I think in an ideal world, there would their competition is good, but there's also potential, more than enough potential projects. I guess the challenge is just um, Indonesia. The challenge is really like financing and also making getting these projects done fast enough or getting them done efficiently enough. So I'm curious. I'll be very curious to see how this plays out. I think at this point, it's very clear Japan, and it has gained a reputation in Indonesia for being a very efficient, someone who follows through, and has done a good job creating high quality rail projects and rail infrastructure. And that's going to give, I think, Japan a lot of advantage as we move forward, and Indonesia looks for more countries to invest, more regions looking for rail infrastructure. But the question is, does Japan have the capacity and the financial kind of capability to actually pursue so many projects simultaneously? I'm curious about that. If Japan has the capacity to meet Indonesia's need alone.
Probably not. But
Hmm.
to what extent can Indonesia afford these projects? I mean, big infrastructure projects all over the world. Love to see more, rail projects which cut down on usage of cars and CO2 emissions and things like this. Like in the United States and other places where Japan's rail has also bid, it usually runs up against political obstacles, financial obstacles. In the UK, there's a railway which people say is too expensive. So, what is Indonesia's capability to spend so much money on these modern railways?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think Indonesia is trying as much not to make these like private partnerships rather than kind of having a huge amount of government spending. So I know with the Jakarta MRT, Japan, I think JICA gave the government a very favorable loan that they have to pay back, I think, at a very low interest rate over 50 years. So I think they're looking for these types of development financing to finance a lot of these projects. It's, I think it'll work for rail. It may not work for a lot of the other kind of infrastructure needs that Indonesia has.
I see. Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's very, I don't know how sustainable that kind of financing is. It maybe work now for these projects, but I don't know how sustainable it is going forward. And Indonesia is going to face kind of a lot of decisions because of the pandemic and because uh, natural resource prices, which are a key source of government revenue, such as coal, palm oil, timber, prices are going down quite a bit and affecting government revenues. So Indonesia may not be able to fulfill its side of the bargain going forward. So there may need to be kind of rethinking of what types of projects they pursue.
Okay. And let's take a look at that side of things. You mentioned a couple times that, Jokowi, presented himself originally as sort of the infrastructure president, and that the opening of the MRT in Jakarta kind of gave some real credibility to that claim. So I guess to what extent has his policy been successful so far? I mean, he seems to be the first one to really get these things moving, as you say. And what's his outlook going forward?
I would say, considering everything he had to face, like, the very kind of a bureaucracy that had kind of been entrenched for a long time, a lot of corruption, and kind of a systematic history of failure. Like, it's quite amazing that he was able to be able to push these projects through in such a short time. To be able to, yeah, in one term, build it, get an MRT built, launch several rail projects, brand new airports, new highways, new toll roads. He's done quite a bit. Um, but it's questionable, like going forward, it's very questionable I guess it's very questionable how much impact it's actually had in terms of helping Indonesia's economy. Um, are some of these projects, there's a lot of investment, for example, in coal, and there's also a lot of it funded by Japanese financial institutions. Indonesia already has overcapacity of coal-fired power plants. There's not very much added benefit from building another power plant. Um, so I guess where it's missing is like, are these investments being done strategically and actually with the target of actually meeting the infrastructure needs the country has? I think that's one big question. Now that it's his second term, um, since he was reelected last April and started the second term in November, with looks like a very major global economic slowdown, it'll be interesting if they can continue to finance these projects in the same way. They announced a few weeks ago that China's Belt and Road Initiative would invest something like $80 billion in a bunch of projects all across Indonesia. I'm very curious to see what that looks like. Is that $80 billion of new projects, or is it just $80 billion, like half of it's already been spent? It just looks good for his numbers. And what are they? Are they all coal plants? Are they just mining concessions, or are they like kind of critical infrastructure needs? Um, yeah, it's going to be very challenging, I think, for the second term. Jokowi's second term is going to be very, very challenging. The economy has changed and the global landscape has changed so much.
And under the Indonesian constitution, is second term the final term?
Yeah, so two-term limit.
And what's the prospect look like for his policies to succeed after him? I mean, if he has 3 years or so left, is that right? 3 years left?
Uh, 4 years.
4 years left. 5-year terms.
5-year terms,
Okay.
yes.
So if does he have sort of a ready-made party or a group of successors? Is there a team around him of young brains? I mean, what's it look like? Beyond the Jokowi era, when a lot of these infrastructure projects will really be, going forward.
Yeah, it's a very good question. He picked a vice president. His vice president, Maruf Amin, is I think 89 or 90 years old. So he's obviously not going to be the next president. There's no kind of obvious candidates in his cabinet. He hasn't really said who's going to be a successor. The opposition probably has several potential candidates that they would run against him, including the person who ran as VP for opposition vice president last time, Sandiaga Uno, who's very young, kind of a modern Islamic figure, quite appeals to kind of this kind of business-oriented community. He's a billionaire, very rich, very young, rich. But Jokowi hasn't really he hasn't really stated he hasn't really given a vision for kind of who will succeed him or what he wants the future to be. I think the main thing it'll be interesting to see, I think his legacy project is a new capital. He wants the new capital to open before he steps down, and I think he wants that to be his last kind of gift to Indonesia and something that he'll be remembered for years and years. Like Sukarno, he's kind of followed in the footsteps of Sukarno as this kind of wants to leave this kind of long legacy of kind of infrastructure and kind of monuments to himself, not to himself, but to the country.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, let's
but
hope
yeah,
he
it's
doesn't. Let's hope he doesn't end like Sukarno. Um, so,
why not?
and the new capital. Let's talk about that for a moment. How far is it from Jakarta, and would it have a rail line, or what would be the link between it and Jakarta?
Yeah, so it's on a different island. So it's on the island of Borneo. That location was chosen because it's kind of the geographic center of the country. And I think it's also part of a movement to shift kind of the center of power away from Java. Java being the island Jakarta is on, it's about 50% of the population. It's always been just kind of much more economically developed than the rest of the country. So you have a big divide between kind of the outer islands that are very undeveloped and kind of Java being much more developed. So having a capital in Borneo near the center of the country would be like an idea to kind of devolve power away from Java. The plans have not been set. They claim it's going to be like an eco-friendly green capital and a forest capital. They say they're going to use the most high-tech transportation technology. It's going to be like they want to avoid the mistakes of Jakarta. So it's supposed to be like a very car-free um, city. So I imagine like there should be rail. They want international investment. Um, like his name is not on the top of my head, but the CEO of SoftBank. Um,
Yeah, Masayoshi Son.
yeah, so he's on the board for the new capital project.
Hmm.
So I think SoftBank is one of the companies that they really want to invest. So I think there's a big role for Japanese companies and the Japanese government because they want the new capital to be, I think, 70 or 80% private or foreign financed for the infrastructure and everything around it. So it's probably I think the next big thing we're going to start seeing in the next few years, like how this capital is going to be built and who's going to participate.
Well, if he wants it done before he steps down, that's 4 years, and that's a pretty steep timeline for building a capital city.
Yeah, I don't think they want it. Well, I don't think they want it done, but I think they want to have at least they want to be able to move some functions of government there
Hmm.
symbolically. So kind of have a symbolic opening of the new capital, but not the full city being built.
I see.
That would not. I don't think that's possible. And now that it's been delayed for about 6 months because of the pandemic, it's probably less likely.
Hmm. All right. Well, related to these topics, my traditional last question is always: is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you that you think is important to mention in this context?
I would just say like, you know, Indonesia and Japan specifically have had a very, very long and productive kind of relationship. I think for many decades, many years, Japan was the number one trading partner for Indonesia, and Indonesia's been the number one recipient of Japanese overseas development assistance for many, many years. Um, but I think the two countries, especially on the Japanese side, I don't think Japanese people know much about Indonesia or have much knowledge about what's going on there. I think that Japan should pay a lot more attention to what's happening in Southeast Asia, and I think that relationship is one that is worth nurturing. It's provided a lot of rewards for both sides. I think Indonesians have a very positive, sentiment about Japan and Japanese investment and Japanese companies, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for Japan to kind of play a very positive role in kind of helping Indonesia, both economically, but also I think politically and socially. And I think I would love to see Japan be more proactive and, I would like to see more Japanese people and more Japanese companies kind of doing exchanges or looking at infrastructure, looking at ways to kind of deepen that partnership more.
Hmm. Yeah, it's as a historian, I recall reading that whereas in places like China during the Pacific War, Japan was considered to be very much an occupier and an enemy, but in the case of Indonesia, it basically broke the power of the Dutch in the Indonesian islands and allowed them to gain their own independence 4 years after the war. So Japan's role was considered more positively as kind of more like a liberator
Mhm.
than as an occupier. So the, the
Yeah,
the attitude towards Japanese it tends to be much more positive there.
right. And Sukarno, he had one of his wives was Japanese. I
Yes,
think a
she's
lot of
still
people
around.
forget that.
Yeah, Devi
And
Sukarno's still a celebrity in Japan.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I learned a lot in this very short speakeasy, and it gives me good foundations for next time we take a look at Indonesia. Um,
Mhm.
so much appreciated, and we'll sign off until next time.